In 1983, Nintendo had a problem. The Famicom was in Japanese homes and its game library was thin. Nintendo needed software and they needed it fast. So they went looking for a developer to build them a golf game. A proper one. 18 holes, real mechanics, something worthy of the platform. One by one, the developers they approached looked at what was being asked of them and said no. The hardware constraints were too severe. The cartridge simply couldn't hold the data. It wasn't possible. Then, a 23-year-old programmer at a 5-person company nobody had heard of said he could do it. There was no established method for what he was proposing. No compression technique to borrow, no playbook to follow. He would have to invent the solution from scratch, fit 18 holes of golf into a cartridge that had no business holding them, and then build a swing mechanic so intuitive that every golf game made after it would copy it without a second thought. I mean, he didn't have to do all that, but he did all of it anyways. And then, more than 20 years later, Nintendo hid his game inside a modern console as a secret tribute that only the people who loved him would ever know to look for. This is the story of golf and the man who built it on today's trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello and welcome to the 296th episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people who created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby video games a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what to get back to the world and its legacy. Today, we are looking back at golf. The 1984 Nintendo Famicom title from Nintendo that set the template for pretty much the entire golf genre moving forward. Introduced the world to one of the most important programmers in the history of the medium, and proved that sometimes the simplest idea executed perfectly is indeed the one that lasts. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, a man who I have no doubt approaches golf the same way he approaches most things in life, with complete confidence, absolutely no preparation, and a very generous interpretation of the rules. He is, of course, my brother, Rob Casson. Rob, what is your golf handicap?
Are we talking game or IRL in real life?
Do you have two separate ones?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh. Okay. Do you actually have a real life handicap? Do you play enough to have a real life handicap?
I don't, but I can guarantee that it would be around 20.
Okay. Okay.
But realistically, it should be 34.
The last time I picked up a golf club, you and I were together.
So 2 years, 3 years, 3,
Oh, over 3 years now.
4. Holy shit! God damn.
Has it been 4 years since you've been here?
It was summertime of some year.
It was right before I had my back surgery, and I had my back surgery 3 years ago in October. So it would have had to have been the summer. It would have had to been the summer before that. So we're going on 4 years.
Well, there you go.
There you go.
4
I was
years since you swung a club.
probably not the best thing to do when you're about to have back surgery.
You know, it probably wasn't, but at least you had fun.
I did have fun, and by that point, the damage was already done, and the surgery to correct it was scheduled. So, c'est la vie. So,
Lavi.
do we have a video game golf handicap then?
I mean, depending on the game, we could have no handicap or anywhere from couple to five, realistically. I
I
mean,
don't
like we not Wii Golf, but like Mario Golf, I was pretty damn good. I don't think I needed a handicap in that one. But like PGA Tour 25 or whatever they are, I'd probably be around a 10.
I don't know if I've ever calculated a handicap for myself at any point.
I mean, how much do you like golf, Dave?
Video game wise, I was pretty addicted to it for a while. I've played a lot of Tiger Woods golf. I've played a lot of Hot Shots golf, and I remember that when I was young and we used to rent the Nintendo 64 from the video store, that one of my favorite games to get was a game called Wily Country Golf or Country Club or something like that. It was I'm pretty sure it was my first like 3D-ish golf game, and I was pretty hooked on that. I was pretty hooked on that. And then yeah, that led to Hot Shots, which led to Tiger Woods. I've played a lot of Tiger Woods.
Fair enough. Well,
Uh,
you got me beat on the video game front. So, but hey, I mean, usually you just you shoot, you play. You don't have to think about that kind of thing.
what do we play now? Golf with your friends? Is that the one? Is that the one?
I don't know
Or
about
Battle
you, but it's
Golf?
super battle golf. Let's
Super
go.
Battle Golf. That's right. That's the one we were talking about doing recently that you played with your friends.
Yes, it is pretty fun.
I used to play a lot of 3D Ultra Mini Golf too. When 3D first became a thing, that was the novelty to me because it was 3D.
Indeed. Well, hey, before we talk more about golf, Dave, because I'm sure we could go on and on, but we have a topic to get to, which is golf, coincidentally. I think people should hear about what's going on this week in gaming history first.
Yes, perhaps they should. Always you keeping me in line. That's
Sometimes.
that's your job. All right, hit the listeners with what else we're doing in gaming history this week.
Kicking it off, April 28th, 1980, Game & Watch Ball was released in Japan, developed and published by Nintendo. It was the first entry in the Game & Watch series, designed by Gunpei Yokoi, after watching a salaryman idly pressing buttons on a calculator during a bullet train commute. The idea that a compact, discrete game device could be built from the same LCD technology used in calculators sparked something that would change Nintendo's entire trajectory. Before Ball, Nintendo was carrying debt of 7 to 8 billion yen. Within a year of its release, those debts were paid, and the company had 4 billion yen in the bank. The series eventually sold 43.4 million units worldwide, and the philosophy behind it, making affordable, portable entertainment using mature, cost effective technology, would become the foundation for everything Nintendo built in the decades that followed.
It's funny, that period of Nintendo history is really fascinating, right? Because no one looks at Nintendo in any way, shape, or form and thinks this company is at risk of going under, you know? But they were in big trouble going into the 1980s. And it's like the floodgates just opened at once because they found success with the Game and Watch series. They found success with Donkey Kong, and collectively those two things just foot the bill for what helped Nintendo become a global phenomenon, which is the Famicom and so on and so forth. So,
And you hit it right on the nail there, Dave. I think that it's fair to say that for a global audience. Now, if you speak with people from Japan and in alive during that era, it may not be as surprising because they would have known Nintendo from their other ventures prior to 1980.
oh yeah,
Um, but
yeah,
yes, for a global
Nintendo.
audience, yeah, we've only ever known it once they became a global phenomenon.
That's actually a very valid point. Yeah, because before the Famicom, they were not known very well at all. So
And
valid
after
point.
that, they took off.
They sure as heck did. What else did Nintendo do?
Well, on April 27th, 1992, Kirby's Dream Land was released for the Nintendo Game Boy in Japan, developed by HAL Laboratory and published by Nintendo. It was the debut of both the Kirby character and a 19-year-old designer named Masahiro Sakurai, who had joined HAL just a few years earlier. The character himself started as a placeholder blob that nobody ever got around to replacing, and the team grew so fond of it that they kept him. The game only received 20,000 advance orders, which was so low that HAL asked Nintendo to step in and publish it. Nintendo's marketing campaign turned it into a chart topping success, selling over 5 million copies worldwide. The name Kirby was chosen from a list submitted by Nintendo of America, named after John Kirby, the lawyer who had successfully defended Nintendo against Universal Studios in a lawsuit a decade earlier. Sakurai always intended the character to be pink, but the Game Boy's monochrome screen meant nobody would know that for years.
That was my daily history video on the social medias yesterday. And initially, Nintendo of America thought that Kirby was white. And some people at Nintendo thought that he was yellow, including Miyamoto. And they pushed forward with the white. I actually posted a commercial that Nintendo of America used to promote Kirby right off the bat. And Kirby is really white and looks nothing like Kirby in the commercial, by the way. So if you want to see a weird little historical deal, check it out. So, and actually, Game and Watch was today, I think. If you want to see the old Game and Watch commercials, how Nintendo was presenting them when they let the Game and Watch series roll, check out today as well. So some really cool old school visuals that you can check out if you're interested in learning more.
Indeed. Sticking with Nintendo, on April 27th, 2000, The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask was released for the Nintendo 64 in Japan, developed and published by Nintendo. It exists because Eiji Aonuma didn't want to redesign Ocarina of Time's dungeons for the 64 DD peripheral. When he told Shigeru Miyamoto as such, Miyamoto challenged him to make an entirely new game instead, with one condition. He had 1 year to do it. Aonuma and his team finished in 15 months by reusing the engine and assets from Ocarina of Time, a decision born of necessity that ended up shaping the game's identity entirely. The development was so grueling that the writers quietly embedded complaints about the crunch directly into the game's script. The result? One of the most unusual and beloved entries in the Zelda series, earning a 95 on Metacritic and selling over 3 million copies worldwide, including a remaster for the Nintendo DS, 3DS,
Yes,
which
indeed.
I have happened to. Actually, never mind, it was Ocarina of Time. I had a copy of that borrowed from the same person who was Ocarina of Time edition I've had for the last 8 years. Shout out him. Thank you.
Yeah, indeed.
I'll get around to it, I swear. All right. Next up, breaking away from the Nintendo mold, on April 29, 2003, Maple Story was released in South Korea, developed by Wizit and published by Nexon. It was a free to play, two dimensional, side scrolling MMORPG at a time when the genre was dominated by three dimensional worlds with monthly subscription fees, and almost nobody thought the concept would work. It reached 100,000 concurrent users almost immediately after launch and 2 million registered users shortly after. The game expanded to Japan, China, Southeast Asia, North America, and Europe over the following years. By 2020, it had accumulated over 180 million registered accounts worldwide and earned more than $3 billion in lifetime revenue, pioneering the free to play business model that would eventually reshape the entire gaming industry.
Boo free to play model. Boo microtransactions.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but you could also be in one of those games where it's all cosmetic and it doesn't really matter, and
True statement.
you just play the game because you enjoy it. I've played many games like that, and I mean, while there are some that I contribute to because I enjoy so much, um, not all of them are going to be like that. But you get people who
No.
are. So, yeah.
It all started with Maple Story. Definitely popularized that model and showed just about the entire world that it was financially a smart way to go.
Indeed, there will always be people who want those little things that no one else has without money.
Mm-hmm.
Last out for this week in gaming history, on April 30th, 2013, Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon was released for PlayStation 3, with Windows and Xbox 360 following the next day. Developed by Ubisoft Montreal and published by Ubisoft, it was built in roughly 6 months on top of Far Cry 3's existing engine and assets, a standalone love letter to 1980s action films starring a cybernetic soldier named Sergeant Rex Power Colt, voiced by Michael Biehn of Terminator fame, with a synthwave soundtrack by the Australian duo Power Glove. Neat. Ubisoft announced it on April Fool's Day, and most people assumed it was a joke. But it wasn't. The game sold over 1 million copies and became the fastest selling downloadable title in Ubisoft history for the time, proving that a team with a clear creative vision and a healthy disregard for conventional expectations could build something that outperformed nearly everything around it.
It's an incredibly fun game if you've never tried it.
Can't say that I have, but honestly, Power Glove is pretty fantastic, so I'd have to listen to it just for the soundtrack.
Yeah, it's not a big investment, not a long game, and it's a lot of fun. If you are a fan of 1980s action films, it is pretty damn spot on. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Sounds good, Dave, but that's not the story people are here to hear. Here to hear? That's
They're
weird to
here to
say.
hear whatever I tell them, okay? Let's be
No, Dave, they're
honest.
here because today we're talking about golf. So why don't we kick it back and find out the origins of golf?
They would still show up if I was not talking about golf, to be fair.
I think more people would,
Yeah, probably.
but no hate on the golf enjoyers because I get it.
No hate on the golf
It's fun.
enjoyers. Well, we've talked about I don't know, pinball. What else do we?
Chess.
Uh,
That one was
yeah,
rough. The
yeah,
only episode
chess.
I ever hosted. Ugh, gross. Um, yeah, that's really all I remember.
Yeah. The origins of golf are debated by historians. But what we do know is that the modern game as we know it took shape in Scotland during the Middle Ages. Now, some of the debate centers on what came before that. The Chinese, for example, played a game called Shuan as far back as the 10th century, sending a ball toward a target hole with a club. The Dutch played a game called Kolf with a K on frozen canals and open fields with clubs and scoring in a way that shares more than a passing resemblance to what we recognize as golf today. And the argument for a lot of people is that these games didn't just run parallel to golf. There is a belief that they traveled, right? That they were carried by merchants and immigrants into Scotland, where they were shaped by the land and the Scottish people into something new. And the land had a lot to do with it. The linksland along Scotland's eastern coast, that narrow strip between the beach and the inland farms, was too sandy for crops and really too exposed for much else. And so it was essentially useless ground, which made it perfect for a game. And that land became the old course at St. Andrews. And the old course at St. Andrews has been played on since at least the 15th century and now is kind of recognized as the spiritual home of golf worldwide. And golf has been incredibly popular. Golf was apparently so irresistible that in 1457, King James II tried to ban it, not because golf was dangerous, but because golf was too popular. The men were spending their time on the course instead of practicing archery. the kingdom needed archers. That ban didn't stick. Neither did ones they tried to impose in 1471 or 1491. Golf kept winning over and over and over again. By the mid 18th century, modern golf as a game was being formalized. In 1744, the Honorable Company of Edinburgh Golfers wrote down the first official rules of golf, 13 of them. Now the game has a set of rules, a constitution, if you will. A decade later, the Society of St. Andrews Golfers was founded, and when King William IV granted it royal patronage, it became the Royal and Ancient Golf Club of St. Andrews. In 1764, St. Andrews standardized the golf round at 18 holes, and the rest of the world would eventually follow. As a sport, the first Open Championship was held at Prestwick in 1860. 12 golfers competed against one another. Willie Park Sr. won. The trophy was a red leather belt, and the title was Champion Golfer of the Year. And so now what we're seeing is that what had been just a Scottish pastime was now kind of becoming a sport. And then to be fair, the British Empire, like it does with most things, just takes it everywhere, right? Golf followed the empire's reach as it colonized across the globe. It went into India and Australia and Canada and South Africa. It crossed the Atlantic. The first permanent golf club here in the United States was founded in Yonkers, New York in 1888 by a man named John Reed, who is now known as the father of American golf. Within a decade, the sport had taken root across the country. And to be fair, early on here, it was concentrated almost entirely among the wealthy, right? Golf is traditionally known as a wealthy sport, although I would say that they've kind of largely cast that off nowadays, right?
Sure.
Do you still think golf is a wealthy sport? Do you think it's a sport of privilege anymore?
I think that it definitely isn't the most inclusive because there is cost to a lot of the greens, but there are also very cheap ones. If you know where to look, like at least in Michigan, some of your state parks have them, and they're last I checked, $10, which for some might be unaffordable, but you know, go to a
I got
garage
kicked
sale.
I got kicked off one of those courses once
How?
by having people with me that were not playing golf.
Ah, okay, that makes sense.
I had an audience, and so we got kicked off of one of the one of the courses in one of the state parks. I don't remember which one.
That's fair. Well, next time just have them bring some clubs to like putt, and then just they're your
And in
putters.
hindsight, I should have, but we were young at the time and not thinking about it. So,
That's fair.
and we just took the L and left.
Fair enough, as one does.
Early on here, country clubs were springing up outside every major American city, and golf was their centerpiece, right? Membership was by invitation. The fees were steep. The demographics were narrow, right? By the turn of the century, golf in America was less of a sport and more so a social institution. It was a place where people gathered to do business, make connections, and unfortunately, I think reinforced the boundaries of who belonged and who didn't. And I think that's kind of it's a wealth thing, right? Country clubs aren't known for being inclusive. Let's just put it at that. The USGA, the United States Golf Association, formed in 1894 to govern the American game. The first US Open was held the following year at the Newport Country Club in Rhode Island. And so now golf has its structure, its rules, and its gatekeepers, right? Here early on, it's a wealthy sport. What it didn't have as a result was the broader public's imagination. It was something that was still unattainable to most people. That changed on a September afternoon in 1913 at the Country Club in Brookline, Massachusetts. The two best golfers in the world had come over from England for the US Open. Harry Vardon was a 6-time Open champion. Ted Ray was the reigning British Open winner. What these heavy favorites didn't account for was a 20-year-old amateur named Francis Ume, who had grown up in a modest house directly across the street from that course and had worked there as a caddy when he was a boy. After 72 holes, all three of them were tied. In the playoff the next day, Francis beat them both. The story landed on front pages all across the country. A kid from a working class family, a former caddy, had walked into one of the most exclusive courses in America and beaten the two best players in the world. At that point, an estimated 300,000 Americans played golf here in 1913. A decade later, even with a world war in between, to be fair, that number had grown to over 2 million.
Wow.
Now, this was a turning point for golf, but it definitely didn't democratize golf overnight, right? The country clubs were still there. They were still exclusive. They were still carefully managed, but he definitely put a crack in the system, right? He showed that the game didn't belong only to the people who had claimed it for themselves up until this point. The Masters tournament at Augusta National launched in 1934, and with it came the idea of golf as a genuine spectacle, something worth watching on its own terms. And of course, television came around and carried that notion even further still. By the middle of the 20th century, golf had completed its journey from useless Scottish linksland to global institution. And this whole time, the conversation about who it was actually for was evolving. Realistically, even as we're here in the 1930s, it was just beginning. I mean, it's in a completely different place nowadays, right?
Yeah, I would agree.
So when home video games arrived in the late 1970s, golf was really a natural fit. Because take a moment and think about what golf actually is. It's turn based, it has a defined scoring system, it has clear rules and measurable outcomes, and a built in challenge structure that scales with the player's skill. You don't need to simulate a team. There's no need for a crowd. There's no clock running down on the situation. You need a ball, you need a club, and you need a hole. For early game developers working as we know they did with severe hardware limitations, that simplicity wasn't a compromise. It wasn't a hindrance. It was quite literally an invitation. The first golf video game appeared in 1978 on the Magnavox Odyssey 2. It was called Computer Golf, and by any modern measure, it was rudimentary, right? It had 9 holes, really basic graphics, controls that were more suggestion than simulation, but it was golf on a screen, and that alone was remarkable enough at the time. Coincidentally, that is the oldest console I own. I have that golf video game.
Nice. That's crazy. I don't even know what that console is.
Odyssey 2,
Yep, never seen one.
the Atari 2600 got its own golf game 2 years later in 1980. Certainly a small step forward, but there was a fundamental problem that really remained unsolved at this point, and that is, how do you translate the feel of a golf swing into a button press, right? How do you give a player meaningful control over something as nuanced as club selection and power and trajectory on hardware that could barely push pixels around a screen? And the reality of the situation is, when it comes to the Atari, the Odysseys, you couldn't at the time. There was, you press a button and the ball goes. There wasn't anything related to that. The technology wasn't there. The systems weren't capable of it. But it was a problem that intrigued people, so it was a problem that needed a solution. A Japanese developer called Data East took a serious run at that problem in 1981. Their game Pro Golf introduced the power bar. It is a horizontal meter that filled as you held a button and locked in when you released it. And that sounds really simple now, because the concept of a power bar is so universal that we stopped noticing it. But in 1981, that was a genuine innovation, giving players a way to feel like their timing and their judgment actually mattered. The Powerball didn't just solve a golf problem, it really solved a sports game problem, because developers across all the genres eventually borrowed it. Right? That Powerball is in football and basketball and skateboarding games. Even how high can I jump? you know that that Powerball, which is across the entire sports genre, was the solution to a golf problem.
Hmm. Neat. Kind of weird. Never would have thought that it came from golf.
T&E Soft pushed the concept further with 3D golf simulation on Japanese home computer platforms, chasing something closer to authenticity. So as time was passing, the genre was kind of finding its footing, adding sophistication with each new attempt. But none of these games really broke through to a mainstream audience. They were each experiments, each one inching closer to something that worked. What the genre needed, realistically, was someone to pull it all together, strip the game down to its essentials, and build it right. And that someone was a young programmer at a small Tokyo company called HAL Laboratory. And the game that he built would become the best selling sports title on the most important gaming platform of its era. Now, to understand what Satoru Iwata brought to golf, you really have to understand where he came from. It's a story we've covered before. We're going to blow through it today. He was born in Sapporo in 1959, the son of a government official who had very specific ideas about what a respectable career looked like. Iwata had different ideas. He saved up money from a dishwasher job as a teenager, and he bought himself a programmable calculator, and then spent his spare time writing simple games on it to show his friends. When he got to the Tokyo Institute of Technology to study computer science, his room became so well known as an informal game arcade that classmates called it Game Center Iwata. In 1978, Japan's first personal computer display opened up at the Seibu department store. Iwata started spending time there, tinkering with the machines on display and swapping ideas with whomever else showed up. And one of the people that he met there was helping to found a small software company that was going to be called HAL Lab. Iwata joined HAL part time while he was still in school. That studio in its early days was 5 people in a 1 bedroom apartment. Iwata was the programmer, the engineer, the marketing, And as he later described it with some amusement, the person who ordered the food and cleaned up afterwards. When he graduated in 1982 and took a job with the studio full time, his father stopped speaking to him for 6 months.
Damn. That's some dishonor.
It was a government official's son joining a company, a tiny company, in an industry that was really uncertain. It isn't what his father imagined for him.
No, I get it.
Iwata didn't seem to notice, right? He had already figured out that the Famicom, which was Nintendo's new home console, used a processor that he knew intimately from his years tinkering with Commodore hardware. And so he walked into Nintendo's offices and asked if HAL could develop games for them. By multiple accounts of the story, he understood the Famicom's hardware better than Nintendo's own people did. So they said yes. His first assignment was a port of Joust, completed 2 months ahead of its 3-month deadline. Then Pinball, rescuing a project that had stalled. Then Golf, which everyone else had already turned down. So we're here in 1983, roughly, and Nintendo's Famicom was in Japanese homes, and its library was super thin. The console launched with 3 games, and Nintendo needed software, right? So they reached out to several developers to produce a golf game for the system. One by one, those developers looked at what was being asked of them and turned down the invitation. The problem in their mind was storage. Fitting a proper 18-hole golf course onto a Famicom cartridge with all the data required seemed impossible to them, given the hardware constraints of the time, the small amount of memory that was available on Famicom cartridges. But Satoru Iwata said yes. He later described the decision as reckless. He wasn't entirely wrong. All that data, the course information, the terrain, the obstacles, the gameplay logic itself, had to be compressed into a cartridge that had no business holding it all. And data compression as a technique wasn't really used in game development at the time. There was no established method to borrow. So Iwata sat down and invented his own. He described the process in a 1999 interview, looking back on it with a mixture of pride and disbelief that the kind that tends to accompany the things that we pulled off when we were young and didn't really understand what we were attempting. He said that golf was an extremely impressive program for its time, and that fitting all 18 holes into that cartridge was a major challenge that he had to solve entirely from scratch. The game that emerged from that process was designed by Shigeru Miyamoto, the father of Mario, and it was programmed solely by Iwata. And it introduced something that pretty much every golf game since has borrowed: a 2-click power and accuracy bar for the swing. Press once to start, once to set power, once to set the accuracy. 3 inputs to simulate the arc and timing of a real golf shot. It was elegant, it was intuitive, and it was immediately imitated by every single golf game thereafter. The genre of golf games finally had found its grammar, and Iwata wrote it. Golf shipped on the Famicom in May of 1984. It became the best-selling sports game period on the system, moving over 2.5 million copies in Japan alone. Critics responded warmly, players responded enthusiastically, and the game, like I said, laid down a template that the entire golf game genre would follow for decades. Rob, hearing about Satoru Iwata staring down an impossible data problem with no established solution, no playbook to borrow from, just a tiny programmer in Tokyo inventing his own compression method from scratch to make something work after everyone else passed on it. It sounds like a big deal. And it all makes me genuinely grateful that starting a podcast didn't require any big deal of the such.
Yeah, no cartridge limitations, no inventing new technology just to get the thing off the ground.
Nothing like that. And
Nothing.
that's largely because we use Zencaster, right? It's the all-in-one podcasting platform that takes the technical chaos out of the process entirely. Just log in from your browser, hit record, and you're instantly capturing studio quality audio and up to 4K video. There is no complicated setup, no compression routines that you have to invent yourself to get it all to work.
What about when things go wrong? Because they always do.
They sure do. Well, that's where Zencaster's multi-layered backups come in. Even if your connection drops, your recordings stay safe in the highest quality. There's no lost work and no starting over.
And what about the editing?
Well, Zencaster's post-production tools automatically clean up your background noise, trim your filler words, and ballast your audio. It's a lot of polish without much grind.
And once it's done, how do I get it out there?
Zencaster distributes your podcast directly to all the major platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all from the same dashboard. In one place, you can record, refine, and release.
So basically, the opposite of cramming 18 golf courses into a Famicom cartridge.
Absolutely. Go over to zencaster.com/pricing. Use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and you can get 30% off the first month of any Zencaster paid plan. If you've got a story to tell, Zen Zencaster makes sure that the only impossible problem is figuring out what to talk about next.
No custom compression required.
None whatsoever. Head over to Zencaster, use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and you can get 30% off your first month.
All right. So golf ships, it sells, it sets the template. What's next?
Well, Goff's influence on the games that followed was immediate and lasting. The two click swing mechanic that Iwata built became the foundation that every single developer reached for when they set out to make a golf game. You can literally trace a direct line from that Famicom cartridge to nearly every golf title that came after it. The first to follow in any meaningful way was a game called Leaderboard, released in 1986 by Axis Software. Where Nintendo's golf was clean and spare, Leaderboard pushed towards presentation and atmosphere. It was a hit on home computers, spawned several sequels, and eventually it evolved into the Lynx series, which spent the better part of the 1990s setting the standard for golf simulation on PCs. Nintendo itself kept returning to golf in ways that read, in hindsight, like a thread running through the company's entire history. 3 years after the original, Nintendo released two follow up titles exclusively for the Famicom Disk System in Japan. Golf Japan Course arrived in February of 1987, and Golf US Course followed in June. Both those games feature Mario as the playable character, and they refine the formula that the original had established. They add proper distinctions between fairways and rough grass. They turn trees into genuine obstacles rather than boundary markers, and they just kind of polish the overall feel of the game. Now, Golf US Course went a step further. It supports up to 4 players, and given that Mario is the main character, it is the first game in the entire Mario franchise to have more than 2 players as an option. Fun little fact for you. Fun little game trivia fact for you. These two games are Japan only releases that most Western players never saw, but they were doing important work, right? They were iterating on that foundation and pointing towards what the series would eventually become. Now, Golf US Course also introduced something that feels genuinely ahead of its time. Both the disk system games came on blue discs, which made them compatible with a device called the Disk Fax. That was a machine. These disc fax machines were installed in department stores and public spaces across Japan. Players could bring their saved game data to one of these machines and transmit their scores directly to Nintendo. Nintendo was running a national competition around the Game Golf US course that drew tens of thousands of participants. The top 100 players would receive trophies, and they, along with nearly 10,000 others, received a gold Famicom cartridge of Nintendo's Punch Out. And then there was the unannounced prize, the one that nobody knew existed until they earned it. 1,000 players who had scored a hole in one were sent a gold disc containing Golf Special Course. That is an exclusive version of the game that exists nowhere else. So here we are, it's 1987. Nintendo is running national competitions through department store kiosks, right? They're handing out gold cartridges and hiding secret prizes for only the best players who arbitrarily hit what they're looking for. It's this idea of connecting to a central network, tracking their scores, and rewarding achievements with exclusive content, right? That sounds like something that was invented in the internet age, but it's 1987. Kind of cool.
That is pretty cool.
You know, here Nintendo is doing the same thing with floppy disk and fax machines 30 years before it becomes an actual thing. Then in 1991 comes NES Open Tournament Golf. It was a very different kind of game entirely, right? Bigger, more elaborate, with international courses that were found in Japan, Australia, France, the UK, and the United States. Mario is the playable character in this one, with Princess Peach as his caddy. And then if you were in two-player mode, Luigi would be the other player. NES Open Tournament Golf is the game that Satoru Iwata later described as his first experience developing a title completely from start to finish. And it was also, funny enough, related to your week in gaming history. It's also the first game in the very first job period in the video game industry for a young sprite designer named Eiji Aonuma, who would later go on to direct the Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. Fun little fact there for you too, Rob.
Very nice.
NES Open Tournament Golf planted a seed that grew into something much larger. In 1999, Camelot Software Planning took the foundation that Nintendo had built and turned it into a full franchise, releasing Mario Golf for the Nintendo 64. Where the earlier games had leaned into full simulation, Mario Golf was more so about personality, right? Mushroom Kingdom courses, Mario characters with individual stats and playing styles, that kind of thing. There was a companion Game Boy Color version of the game with role-playing elements that let you level up your golfer over time. This N64 version received universal acclaim and is considered the first entry in what is now a series that has spanned 6 Nintendo platforms over more than 2 decades, right? There are Super Mario there are Mario Golf games for the GameCube, to the Game Boy Advance, to the Nintendo 3DS, to the Nintendo Switch, where Mario Golf Super Rush arrived in 2021. Every one of those games in some form owes itself to what Iwata built in 1984. And of course, we know the genre is built outside of that, right? Electronic Arts entered the space in 1990 with PGA Tour Golf. That brought real courses and real players to the genre for the first time. That franchise grew steadily through the decade until 1998, when a young golfer named Tiger Woods signed on to lend his name to the series. And then the Tiger Woods PGA Tour games dominated the genre for 15 years, selling hundreds of millions of dollars worth of copies and introducing golf games legitimately to an audience that had never and may never pick up a golf club, right? And then Wii Sports came out in 2006, which really did something extraordinary. The golf component, the one that put millions of people on their feet in living rooms across the world, was built directly on the courses that Iwata had designed in that original Famicom cartridge. More than 23 years later, the foundation that Iwata laid in 1984 Golf was still holding. And through all of it, the original game just sits quietly in Nintendo's history. It is quietly celebrated. It's been re-released. It's been emulated. It's the best-selling sports game on the Famicom, the title that, set the template for an entire genre, just quietly making an appearance in Wii Sports in 2006. Now, if you don't know, Iwata went on to become the president of HAL and then eventually the president of Nintendo itself. He was the first person to ever hold the title of president of Nintendo without a family connection to the company's founders. He is a revolutionary figure in video game history, beloved by developers and players alike, known for his warmth and his philosophy, as well as his programming genius. Unfortunately, we lost him in 2015 at the age of 55. Nintendo did something here that says a lot about how we perceive Iwata and how we cherish the memory of him. Because when the Switch first came out, hidden inside the firmware of the Nintendo Switch was a copy of 1984 Golf. It wasn't advertised, it wasn't documented. It was just there waiting. To find it, you had to set the system clock to July 11th, which is the anniversary of Iwata's death, and then perform his signature gesture with the Joy-Con controllers. It was a hand spread motion that he would use at the end of every Nintendo Direct presentation, along with the words directly to you.
Holy shit. That's crazy. I never would have known that. I wonder.
Yeah, I know. I don't. It's early firmware. I believe it doesn't work in. I believe it doesn't work in modern firmware.
I was just thinking I might still have one that's on original firmware or very close to it. I'm gonna have to look into that. That could be cool. But that's a hell of a thing. That's, that's a huge dedication right there.
It is a huge dedication. Iwata's first great challenge, buried inside a modern console as a secret that only people who loved him would ever really know to look for. That's the kind of legacy that doesn't really ever show up in sales figures.
Absolutely.
Well, today's episode sent you deeper into the world of Satoru Iwata and HAL. We have plenty of ground already covered that connects directly to the story. Episode 191 tells the full story of Kirby's Dream Land, game we touched on briefly in today's history segment, and the 19-year-old designer who built it. Episode 35 covers the original Super Smash Bros., another HAL production that Iwata famously helped rescue when the team ran out of memory during development. Man was a genius programmer. And episode 238 explores Pokemon Snap, one of HAL's more unexpected projects, and a game that came to life through the same creative spirit that defines everything in this company's catalog. Between those three episodes and today's, you have a decent picture of one of the most quietly influential studios in the history of video games. You can, of course, find those episodes and everything else in our archives at www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can people find when they head to the site?
You can find our calendar with our future episode topics, know what we'll be talking about in the upcoming weeks and months. You can find a link to our Discord server where you can come chat with Dave and I about episode topics or other gaming related things or who knows what else. You can find a link to our Patreon where you can help support us and get access to ad-free and unedited versions of all of our episodes. And you can find links to our social media where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David is Wrong. Each week, we'll tell you one story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game, a person, a technology, a console. We've even covered a few places as well. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. When we sit down to research new topics each week, we get excited when we find out new things to share with you. It's this fantastic cycle of learning and teaching, teaching and learning, learning and teaching, teaching and learning. And in celebration of this constant cycle, we like to talk about our takeaways each week. Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, I originally had thought that the coolest part was the competition with the department stores. Like you mentioned, it was kind of like something out of the internet age, but 30 years earlier. It's just the logistics of that are still mind blowing to me. Just trying to keep everything up to date with all of that, and like there had to be like somewhere central that was doing it, doing all the data, and then sending it to everyone. And it just seems like a lot without the internet. But hey, they managed to make it, and that's why they were successful. Um, but honestly, the little dedication with the golf and the original Switch firmware, I think kind of took away that one. Like I said, that's just one of those things. It's so obscure and so difficult that if you don't know it's there, you're not going to find, or unless you're doing the like rooting through the source code and understand all of that, which not many do. But I just think that that's really huge. That was a really touching thing. It's pretty cool.
I absolutely agree.
So that's it for me, Dave. What about yourself?
I'm really fascinated by the fact that the click power bar mechanic came from a random golf game in the 1980s. It There's these things that we take for granted in modern gaming. Things like, health bars and power bars and scores and jumping, and it all just seems so silly and commonplace, but it wasn't at one time. We don't ever really think about where these things come, because for most gamers of younger generations, it all just existed. But that wasn't the case, right? There were golf games that didn't have that clicky bar. There were sports games that didn't have the power bar, and it's really fascinating to learn where some of these basic things come from. Like the health bar, for instance, I believe the first game that ever was in was a Star Trek title. You never think about these things.
Very neat.
Yep.
That's fair. You also, yeah, it's so commonplace nowadays. I don't really think twice about it. But yeah, there was a time.
Well, let's be honest. The only other realistic innovation we had was the analog stick, because once we got the analog stick, for a while, we had the real swing, right? Tiger Woods introduced that. And maybe some of the early games did, but you had the stick, that was your power, and that was your accuracy, right? But I think a lot of games went back to the 3-click, and you have your choice nowadays in a lot of games whether or not you want to use analog or 3-click. And I think a lot of people really like the 3-click method.
Yeah, that's fair. I do think it's also a lot simpler once you have the timing down. So
I agree. All right, Rob. Well, before I take it out of here and into next week, is there anything else you'd like to add to today's episode?
I'll just take a moment to say thank you so much to everyone for listening. It means the world, and we appreciate you being along as we go down this trip down memory card lane.
Yes, indeedy. Golf has survived a lot, right? Three royal bands in 15th century Scotland, the country club gatekeepers who tried to keep it exclusive, and then a former caddy from a working class family just kind of cracks the door open on a September afternoon in 1913. Survived television, the Masters, Tiger Woods, and a Wii remote swinging in a living room. And somewhere in the middle of all that history, a 23-year-old programmer in a tiny Tokyo office looked at an impossible problem, invented a solution from scratch, and built a game so clean and so right that the entire genre followed his lead without ever looking back. The 2-click power and accuracy bar that Iwata designed is still the way that golf games work today, right? You press once to start, you press once to set your power, and you press once to set your accuracy. 40 years later, that's pretty much still the way we do it. Every golf game you've ever played owes something to what one person built in one room in Tokyo when everyone else said it couldn't be done. Some foundations are so well built that you just stop noticing them. Next week, we are stepping back into the console wars. In 1984, Atari built what they believed was their answer to everything: a powerful new console, backwards compatible with the 2600's enormous library, with graphics that could go toe to toe with anything on the market. The Atari 7800 was ready to ship. The retailers were lined up, and then, almost overnight, it disappeared. What followed is one of the stranger stories in the history of video games. A console that sat finished and shelved for just about 2 years while the industry collapsed around it, only to be released into a world that had already moved on. By the time the 7800 finally reached store shelves, a little gray box from Japan had changed everything. And we're going to talk about how all that came to be. So join us as we tell the story of Atari's last real shot at the throne on next week's trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.
Skibidi-dum-da-ba-ba-ma-da-ba-dum-ba-bow.